Hey, this is Robert Smetana, and today we're finally taking a deep dive into the science on honey to find out how healthy it really is. Now, in the last video, we already talked about topical uses of honey, and today we're talking about internal dietary use of honey. Now, reducing the amount of added sugar in your diet is important to maintain health and to fight all sorts of diseases. But of course, it isn't easy to eliminate all sweetened foods and beverages in your diet. So naturally, we're looking for sweeteners that give us that sweet taste that we like without the negative health consequences that come with regular sugar. And the sweetener that is perhaps most touted for its alleged health benefits is honey. Now, it is very important to scrutinize these health claims associated with honey, especially because it seems that the most common arguments in favor of honey that you hear are that it's healthy because it's natural and it's healthy because it has been used for thousands of years for medical purposes and things along that line. And as I've shown in the last video, neither of those two arguments really have a strong merit or are evidence enough by themselves to support any such health claims. The first one, the idea that something is healthy because it's natural, is known as the appeal to nature fallacy, and I've shown in the last video that that doesn't always hold true. For example, with almonds, which in their truly natural form were actually toxic to humans, and only through very unnatural human intervention, selection, breeding, have they become the healthy food that they are today. And the second idea, the thought that something is healthy because it has been used for a long time, or it has always been perceived as a healthy food, is a type of appeal to tradition fallacy. And that also doesn't always hold true, as I've shown in the last video, with the example of mercury, which also has been used for thousands of years for all sorts of medical purposes. But as it turns out, as we know today, it's not that healthy after all. So that shows that we really need good scientific evidence to come to reliable judgment about the health value of a food. And so that's what we're trying to do today. Now, first off, we're going to look at a few characteristics of honey that partially we already discussed in my series on sweeteners that you can check out here. So first off, we're going to look at glycemic index, which is a measure for how strongly a source of carbohydrate affects our blood sugar levels. A high glycemic index tends to be negative, and low glycemic index tends to be more positive for health. As we see, honey has pretty much about the same glycemic index, just as high as regular white refined table sugar. So not a good start right there. However, honey does in fact vary quite a bit in its glycemic index. However, that seems to be mainly due to its varying fructose content. And as I've explained in the sweetener series, a high fructose level, although it leads to a low glycemic index, is problematic in itself and not a good alternative. So next up, we look at nutritional value, as it is often said that honey contains a lot of natural nutrients that are extracted from the regular white refined sugar. But when we actually look at the nutritional profile, we see that honey has barely any vitamins or minerals, so it doesn't score much better than regular white refined sugar in that category either. Now, next up is fiber content, because fiber is one of those food constituents that can actually offset many of the negative impacts of sugar. Fiber actually fills you up, it slows down the gastric emptying, and so you will feel more satiated. Also, it will, through the slower absorption process, it will lower the glycemic index. Fiber can fight inflammation. And so it's interesting to know if a source of sweetness has some fiber to it, like natural fruits do. And as it turns out in this category, honey unfortunately doesn't score either. Practically no fiber in honey either. Next up, antioxidant content. That is important because oxidative damage in our body can lead to damage to our DNA and tissues. and is implicated in the formation of many diseases. However, this test is done in a laboratory, in a test tube. And so we should be careful with any sorts of sort of translation from this in vitro study to an actual biological in vivo setting. So this really just gives us a rough estimate. Many substances that might have antioxidant properties in the laboratory might not have such in the body. They might be digested, and during the digestion process the molecules are changed or broken down. They might not even get to the cells or inside the cells where they can protect against reactive oxygen species and other pro-oxidative molecules. And so it's really just a rough measure also for amount of phytonutrients. Many phytonutrients, secondary plant metabolites, have an array of positive health aspects and also antioxidant capacity. So it's sort of a very rough estimate for phytonutrient content, which tends to be positive for health. So that being said, let's look at the antioxidant capacity. Here's the regular white sugar, and then some other sweeteners, some brown sugar, raw cane sugar, and here's honey. Again, not much better, especially when we compare it to some dried fruits and even some other sweeteners that are much richer and in antioxidants, such as malt extract, dark molasses, or date sugar, which is actually the whole date ground up. So also in that domain, not a strong argument for honey. And so the next point would be to, actually the first point when you do such a health analysis should be to look at scientific organizations if they have clear statements on a particular food. And here it is very clearly stated by the World Health Organization, the German Society for Nutrition, the Dietetics of Canada, and others, that honey, just like any other added sugar, meaning white sugar, brown sugar, cane sugar, maple syrup, agave nectar, whatever it is, all those natural sugar alternatives or sugar forms, that they should all equally be limited to 10% of total caloric intake, meaning when you're a regular adult eating 2,000 calories a day, that would be 200 kilocalories, which would be about 50 grams of sugar. Now, if you have a syrup, there's some water, so it's a little more than 50 grams in total, maybe 60, 70 grams. That should be the maximum within a healthy diet. Ideally, even, you should reduce it even further down to 5%, meaning 100 calories, meaning about 25 grams of sugar. Let's look at the primary literature as well, because even though these statements from the scientific organizations are very valuable and usually very reliable, there can be reasons why they are incomplete or not completely up to date. So I want to take a deep dive into the literature itself and see if there are actually any interventional studies, meaning are there studies where people actually, or where participants were split into two groups. One group received honey, the other group received regular sugar, and then we see if the health of those two groups will differ after a certain time period. And that's really what we need to come to a final conclusion here. And as it turns out, actually there are a lot of interventional studies on honey, to my surprise, because for pretty much all of those other sweeteners like maple syrup, like agave nectar, etc., you hardly find any interventional trials. However, with honey, we're quite lucky. Actually, there's so many that I can't show them all, or I can't go through all of them in detail. These are the studies that I looked at. I'm gonna pick out a few, which I wanna talk a little bit about, and then I'm gonna show you the compilation of the results in a separate table.